The carriage stopped in front of the house at 3:15, and Mabel Forsyth did not allow herself to look away. It was not what she had expected. She had not expected much. Her father had been honest about that, at least, in the weeks before the wedding. "The Hargrove estate has seen better years," he said, in the careful tone men used when they meant something worse. But seeing it now, the stone face of the building, staring back at her with its dark windows and its vine-strangled gate, she understood that better years was a generous way to put it. The front steps were uneven. A shutter on the second floor hung at an angle no one had bothered to correct. The garden to the left was less a garden than a memory of one. Brown stalks where something had once grown, a stone path barely visible beneath a season's worth of fallen leaves. Mabel stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the driver to assist her. She had her traveling bag in one hand and her composure in the other, and she intended to keep both. The man she had married 3 days ago was not here. He had told her he would not be, in a voice that carried no apology, only fact. "I have business in Providence that cannot wait. Mrs. Alcott will receive you. Make yourself comfortable." He had said it the way a man gives instructions to a new housekeeper, and then he had turned back to his desk, and that had been that. His name was Garrison Hargrove. He was 38 years old. He had been a widower for 4 years. He ran a textile concern that, according to her father's sources, was still solvent, barely. He had needed a wife with a modest dowry and a reputation for practicality. Mabel's father had needed to settle a debt and restore his family's standing in one transaction. Garrison Hargrove had been, as her father put it, a solution to a mutual problem. No one had asked Mabel whether she considered herself a solution. She was 26. She had kept her father's accounts since she was 19. She knew the difference between a ledger that was managed and a ledger that was merely maintained. And she had learned, from watching her father's business decline, what happened when a man confused the two. She had also learned, more quietly, that knowing things was not the same as being permitted to act on them. She was permitted now, apparently, to act on whatever she found here. The front door opened before she reached it. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, with a face that had made peace with difficulty and a posture that had not. She introduced herself as Mrs. Alcott, and she delivered the name the way a person delivers a fact they do not expect to be challenged. "Mrs. Hargrove," Mrs. Alcott said with a small nod. Mabel nodded back. She had been Mrs. Hargrove for 3 days, and the name still landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. She felt the ripple, then covered it. Inside, the house was dim and cold. The ceilings were high enough to make the rooms feel abandoned even when they were not, and the furniture had the air of things that had not been chosen so much as inherited and then ignored. A clock ticked somewhere in the hall. The sound of it was the loneliest thing Mabel had heard in some time. "I'll show you to your room," Mrs. Alcott said. "In a moment." Mabel set her bag down near the door. "How long has the house been in this condition?" A pause. Mrs. Alcott's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "Since the first Mrs. Hargrove passed. 4 years, give or take, and the staff? Myself. Prentice, who tends to the grounds. What tending gets done? A girl who comes on Thursdays." Mabel looked at the dust on the side table, at the curtains that had once been burgundy and were now a color that did not have a name, at the water stain spreading across the ceiling above the staircase, like a map of somewhere no one wanted to go. "And Mr. Hargrove is aware of all this?" "Mr. Hargrove," Mrs. Alcott said carefully, "does not spend much time here." Mabel picked up her bag. "Show me the room, please, and then I'd like to see the household accounts." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Mrs. Alcott said, "Of course," and led the way upstairs. The room was adequate. That was the most honest word Mabel could find for it. The bed was solid, the linens were clean, and a window looked out over what had once been an impressive rear garden, and was now mostly a field of ambition that had given up on itself. She stood at the window for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of where she was. Not the self-pity of it, but the shape of it, its precise dimensions. A house that needed work. A husband who was not here. A life that had been arranged by other people for reasons that had nothing to do with her happiness. Then she unpacked her bag, changed her dress, and went downstairs to find the accounts. Mrs. Alcott produced them with the expression of a woman, surrendering something she had been guarding without knowing why. They were kept in a box in the study, a room that smelled of old paper and closed windows, 3 ledgers and a folder of loose receipts tied together with string. Mabel sat down at the desk, opened the first ledger, and began to read. An hour later, she closed the last one and sat very still for a moment. Then she opened the first one again. The numbers were not, by themselves, wrong. They were tidy numbers, kept in a neat hand, organized by quarter. But there were things in them that required explanation. A management fee paid quarterly to a firm called Whitfield and Sons. Consistent, unremarkable in isolation, but adding up, over 4 years, to a sum that was anything but unremarkable. A maintenance contract for the grounds that had apparently been renewed annually, despite the fact that the grounds clearly had not been maintained. A column of payments to a coal supplier that exceeded, by a significant margin, what a house this size with a staff this small could possibly have burned. Mabel was not an accountant. She had never been to school for it. But she had spent 7 years making sense of her father's finances, and she had learned that the numbers a man wanted you to look at were rarely the ones that told the real story. The real story lived in the spaces between, in the fees that were vague, in the contracts that were never questioned, in the suppliers whose names appeared on invoices, but nowhere else. She found a sheet of paper in the desk drawer and began to make a list. She did not make a decision that night about what to do with it. She simply made the list. That was enough for now. The first letter from Garrison Hargrove arrived 9 days after she did. It was brief. He was extending his stay in Providence. He trusted she had settled in satisfactorily. He asked that she forward any correspondence addressed to him to the office of his associate, Mr. Fielding. He signed it G. Hargrove, not Garrison, and certainly not anything warmer than that. Mabel read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the desk drawer with her list. Then she went to find Prentice. He was behind the house, doing something ineffective with a rake in the general vicinity of the kitchen garden. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and he looked at her the way men looked at women who arrived with questions. Not hostile, exactly, but braced. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "how long have you been on the grounds?" "Going on 11 years now, and before you there was someone else." "Before me there was a full grounds crew, 6 men, in Mr. Hargrove's father's time. Greenhouse too back then." He nodded toward the far end of the garden, where a structure of glass and rusted iron stood like a forgotten promise. "Nobody's used it since." Mabel looked at the greenhouse. She looked at the kitchen garden, which was mostly weeds with aspirations. She looked at the rake in Prentice's hand, which was moving through the leaves in a pattern that suggested habit rather than purpose. "Can it be repaired?" Prentice squinted. "The greenhouse? Parts of it. Then let's start there." She paused. "What do you need?" He told her. It was a reasonable list. Glass panes, putty, 2 specific tools. Not expensive, taken individually. She wrote it down and said she would see to it by the end of the week. He watched her walk back toward the house with the expression of a man recalibrating something. She did not mind. The second thing she found was the contract, or rather, the absence of one. She had written to Whitfield and Sons requesting a copy of the management agreement under which they had been collecting their quarterly fee. The reply came back in 10 days, signed by someone named Mr. Aldous Whitfield, and it was 3 paragraphs of professional warmth that said, in essence, nothing. There was a reference to an arrangement made with Mr. Hargrove in the spring of 1871. There was no mention of a written contract. There was an assurance that services had been rendered in good faith and would continue to be. Mabel read it 3 times, then wrote back. She kept her letter short. She asked 2 questions. First, what specific services had been rendered in the past 4 years, itemized by quarter? Second, could they provide any written documentation of the original arrangement? A letter, a memo, anything signed by Mr. Hargrove. She did not call it what it looked like, not yet. She simply asked the questions. While she waited for the reply, she started on the house. It began with the east wing, which had been shut up since the first Mrs. Hargrove's illness. Mrs. Alcott watched from the doorway as Mabel pulled dust covers off the furniture and opened windows that had not been opened in 4 years. The air that came in was cold and smelled of November, but it was better than what had been sealed inside. "These rooms are good rooms," Mabel said. "It seems a waste." "Mr. Hargrove prefers them closed," Mrs. Alcott said. Mabel turned to look at her. "Does he come home often enough to have a preference?" The silence lasted a beat longer than was comfortable. Then, Mrs. Alcott said quietly, "Not often." "Then, we'll open them." Mabel moved to the next window. "He can close them again when he gets here." Mrs. Alcott was quiet after that, but she helped with the dust covers. The reply from Whitfield and Sons came 3 weeks later. It listed services rendered, vaguely, in language that could mean almost anything. Property oversight, correspondent management, liaison with local contractors. There was no itemized accounting. There was no signed contract. There was instead a second letter, this one from someone higher up the firm, suggesting that any further queries regarding the arrangement should be directed to Mr. Garrison Hargrove directly. Mabel set both letters on the desk beside her list. The list had grown. She had found two additional irregularities in the accounts: a legal retainer for a firm she could find no record of in any correspondence, and a series of payments to a supplier called Croft and Belmore that appeared to have ceased doing business in 1872, 2 years before the payments stopped. She had confirmed the latter by writing to the county business registry, which had confirmed, politely and without apparent concern, that no business by that name had been registered in the county after the spring of 1872. The payments to Croft and Belmore had continued through the fall of 1873. Mabel looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to Garrison Hargrove in Providence. She kept it factual. She said she had been reviewing the household accounts as a matter of responsible management. She said she had questions about several items that did not appear to have adequate documentation. She listed the items. She asked whether he could provide clarification or point her to records she might have missed. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She simply asked the questions that the numbers were asking her. She sealed the letter, addressed it to the office of Mr. Fielding in Providence as instructed, and gave it to the post. Then she went back to the greenhouse, where Prentice had nearly finished replacing the glass in the south wall, and she helped him for the rest of the afternoon without thinking about what she had sent. The first response she received was not from Garrison. It was from a man named Mr. Aldous Whitfield, and it arrived before any letter from Providence could have, which meant someone in Providence had received her letter and telephoned, or telegraphed, Whitfield and Sons directly. The letter was longer this time, and considerably less warm. It explained, in the language of a man who was not used to being questioned, that the arrangement between Whitfield and Sons and the Hargrove estate was a long-standing one, predating the current Mr. Hargrove's assumption of the property, and that it had been maintained in good faith at all times. It suggested, not quite politely, that a newly arrived party with limited familiarity with the estate's history might benefit from some restraint in forming conclusions. Mabel read it at breakfast. She read it again at lunch. Then she sat down and wrote to the County Land Records Office, the Regional Business Association, and the estate's solicitor, a man named Mr. Horace Pell, whose name appeared on a document she had found in the back of the account box, beneath everything else. She did not tell anyone she was writing these letters. She did not explain herself to Mrs. Alcott, who had begun to watch her with an expression that was either concern or admiration, and possibly both. She did not mention any of it to Prentice, who was now asking her opinion about what to plant in the greenhouse, and had started addressing her with a particular directness that felt like its own kind of respect. She simply wrote the letters and waited. It was the solicitor who clarified things. Mr. Pell was a small, precise man who drove out from the town of Hadley in a buggy that matched his disposition. Compact, unadorned, reliable. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon and accepted the offer of tea with the air of a man who had been expecting to be called upon for some time. He confirmed what she had begun to suspect. The arrangement with Whitfield and Sons had originally been established not by Garrison Hargrove, but by his uncle, who had managed the estate briefly in the years immediately following the elder Mr. Hargrove's death. The uncle had since passed. The arrangement had never been formally reviewed. The quarterly fee had continued because no one had stopped it. Mr. Garrison Hargrove was not made aware of the full scope of the arrangement? Mabel asked. Mr. Pell looked at his tea. Mr. Hargrove, in the years following his wife's passing, was not closely attentive to the estate's affairs. I see. He trusted the arrangement because it had always been there. He did not examine it. And the payments to Croft and Belmore. Mr. Pell's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees. That is a somewhat different matter. It was. Croft and Belmore had been a legitimate supplier once. It had also been at one time a partnership in which Aldous Whitfield held a minority stake. When the business dissolved, Whitfield had continued generating invoices and directing payment through the estate's accounts. The amounts were not enormous. Not the kind of thing that would alarm a man who was not looking. But over 2 years, they had added up to a number that was, in Mr. Pell's careful phrasing, not trivial. Mabel thanked Mr. Pell for his time. She asked him to prepare a formal summary of his findings. She asked whether, in his legal opinion, the documentation she had gathered would be sufficient to support a demand for restitution. He looked at her for a moment over his teacup. Then he said, "Yes, Mrs. Hargrove, I believe it would." The letter from Garrison arrived 2 days after Mr. Pell's visit. It was longer than the first one, not much warmer. He had received her letter, he wrote. He had made inquiries. He found the matter, he called it, as though it were a thing at a polite distance, concerning. He intended to return to the estate at the end of the month to review the situation personally. He thanked her for bringing it to his attention. She read that line 3 times. Thanked her for bringing it to his attention. As though she had found a loose shutter and reported it. As though she had not spent 2 months in a house he had abandoned, teaching herself the history of an estate he had stopped caring about, writing letters to men who considered her an inconvenience, rebuilding a greenhouse and opening windows, and asking questions that no one had wanted her to ask. She folded the letter. She placed it in the drawer. She went outside and stood in the kitchen garden, which no longer looked like a field of ambition that had given up on itself. Prentice had turned the soil. She had ordered seed catalogs from a supplier in Hartford and had spent 3 evenings studying them at the kitchen table, marking pages. The greenhouse was now usable. Not beautiful, but functional, which was all she had asked of it. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel, not anger, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of having done something real and being thanked for it by someone who did not fully understand what it had cost. Then she went back inside and wrote to Mr. Pell to tell him that Mr. Hargrove would be arriving at the end of the month and to have the summary ready. He arrived on a Wednesday. She heard the carriage before she saw him. She was in the study, reviewing a letter from the county records office, confirming additional details about Whitfield's original stake in Croft and Belmore, and she heard the wheels on the gravel, and then the sound of the front door, and then Mrs. Alcott's voice in the hall, and then footsteps on the hardwood. She did not go out to meet him. He came to her. He stopped in the doorway of the study. A tall man, broader in the shoulders than she remembered from the wedding, with a face that had the look of a person who had been thinking about something difficult for a long time. He wore the dust of travel and an expression she could not immediately read. He looked at the desk, at the ledgers, at the folder of correspondence arranged in order, at the list she had been keeping, which had grown to 4 pages and was now annotated in 3 colors of ink. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. Mr. Hargrove. She gestured to the chair across the desk. Please sit down. He sat. He looked at her with an expression she did not have a name for yet. Mr. Pell will be here tomorrow, she said. He's prepared a complete summary, but I can walk you through the main points now, if you'd like. How long have you been working on this? He asked. Since the 2nd week. Something moved across his face. He looked down at the desk. Then he said, I should have told you more about the estate before you arrived. Yes, she said. You should have. He was quiet for a moment. You're right. She did not soften it or deflect it. She let it sit there between them, as it deserved to. Walk me through it, he said finally, and she did. She had expected him to push back. She had prepared for it. Not with defensiveness, but with documentation. Every number she stated, she had a record to support. Every claim she made, she had a letter confirming it. She had learned, from years of watching her father argue with men who had more power than reason, that the surest way to be heard was to have nothing that could be disputed. He did not push back. He listened. He asked questions. Real ones. Not the kind designed to create confusion, but the kind a person asked when they were actually trying to understand something. When she explained the Croft and Belmore payments, he was quiet for a long time. When she laid out the Whitfield management fee, he said, 4 years. And his voice had something in it she recognized. Not anger but humiliation. The particular humiliation of realizing you have been managed without knowing it, by someone who counted on your distraction. I'll engage a solicitor in Providence to work with Pell, he said when she was done. Mr. Pell can recommend someone, if needed. He has contacts in the city. Garrison Hargrove looked at her across the desk. You've done more here than I asked. You didn't ask anything, Mabel said. You left. It was not cruel. She did not mean it cruelly. It was simply accurate, and she had stopped, somewhere around week 4, seeing the value in pretending otherwise. He did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands, then back at her. The house, he said. It looks different. The east wing is open. The greenhouse is usable again. Prentice has turned the kitchen garden. We'll be able to plant in the spring. She paused. The water stain above the staircase is from a failed seam in the roof. I've had a quote for the repair. I left it on your desk in the other room. He looked at her for a long moment. The clock ticked in the hall. Why? He said at last. His voice was quieter now. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have simply lived here, done the minimum. Mabel thought about how to answer that. She thought about the night she had arrived, standing in the cold hall with her traveling bag, looking at a house that had stopped being looked after. She thought about the feeling she had had, not pity, but something closer to recognition. A house that had been managed without anyone caring about it. Numbers maintained without anyone wondering what they meant. I don't know how to do the minimum, she said. I never have. He was quiet for a long time after that. He stayed for 2 weeks. She had not expected that. She had expected a few days, long enough to meet with Mr. Pell, review the documents, take steps to address the Whitfield matter. But he stayed 2 weeks, and she observed, over the course of those 14 days, the way a person looked when they were deciding to pay attention again. He walked the grounds with Prentice on the second morning, the two of them moving through the kitchen garden, in the pale November light. She watched from the window of the study, and did not go out to join them. He read through every letter she had filed, sitting in the study in the evenings while she worked at the desk. He asked questions when he had them. He did not ask her to explain herself. He did not volunteer his own history, why he had stopped caring about the estate, what the years after his wife's death had been like, what had made him agree to the arrangements he had agreed to without reading them carefully. She did not ask. It was not, she had decided, her place to ask. Not yet. But she watched. She noticed things. She noticed the way he paused in the doorway of the East Wing one evening, looking at the rooms that had been closed for 4 years, now open to the cold, clean air. He stood there for almost a full minute and did not know she could see him from the hall. She noticed that he took his coffee in the kitchen on the third day, sitting at the table with his coat still on, and that he talked to Mrs. Alcott for half an hour about nothing in particular, the town, the weather, a leak in the roof of the carriage house, in the way of a person who had missed ordinary conversation without knowing it. She noticed, on the 8th day, that he had started saying good morning when he came down for breakfast. He said it to her, not the room. She said it back. She meant it, which surprised her a little. The settlement with Whitfield and Sons was reached the following spring. Mabel was not in the room when it happened. She was in the greenhouse, where the first seedlings had broken the surface of the soil 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and Prentice was informing her of this, with the quietly delighted air of a man for whom good news in the garden always carried a personal significance. She found out about the settlement when Garrison came to the greenhouse door and stood in the frame of it, loosening his collar in the way he did when something was finished, and he had not yet decided how to feel about it. Pell got everything, he said, plus interest. She looked at the seedling nearest to her. A tomato, she thought, or possibly a pepper. She could never quite tell at this stage. Good, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing there, thinking. I've written to my uncle's widow, he said, to explain what was found. She didn't know. That's generous of you. It's accurate, he said. She shouldn't carry it. Mabel set down the small wooden dibber she had been holding. She looked at him. He was watching the seedlings with an expression that was still new enough that she was still learning its edges. Garrison, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She noticed that it landed differently than Mr. Hargrove, less formal, more specific, like a door opening. He looked at her. I think the tomatoes will come in early this year, she said. It was not what she had meant to say. Or perhaps it was exactly what she had meant to say, in the way that the most honest things are often the ones that don't announce themselves. He looked at the seedlings. Then he said, I don't know much about gardens. You could learn, Mabel said, if you stayed. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Prentice was doing something with a watering can that involved more splashing than was strictly necessary. And the greenhouse held the particular warmth of early spring. Not the heat of summer, but the specific warmth of things becoming, which is different in a way that matters. I'd like to stay, Garrison said. Mabel nodded. She picked up the dibber again. She pressed it gently into the soil beside the next seedling, making a small, careful space for something that was not yet ready to be planted but would be, before long. Then stay, she said. The clock in the hall of the house, audible even here, even through the glass, ticked once in the quiet. It was enough.